special Father's Day gift. I got my daughter and her family here with us today. And Kaylin and Michaela have brought other family members with them. So we say welcome to all of you. And Kaylin, I say thank you for being a great dad to my grandchildren. And I mean that. We continue our study of 1 John. Tonight we'll be looking at chapter 4 and how John helps us to identify false teachers. But today we're in chapter 3. What are the benefits of God's love? Well, actually, this morning I can't cover all the benefits. I can only touch the hem of the garment. But this morning, we're going to talk about some of the benefits of God's love. And as we begin this lesson, I need to ask all of you a question. How many, by the show of hands, how many have been happily married 25 years or longer? Wow, I see a lot of hands going up. Guess what? I'm going to tell you something that you may or may not have realized. In a study back in 2009, they looked at people who had been married 25 years or longer. And you're becoming more like each other each day. You adopt your spouse's likes, the restaurants that they like to go to, the activities they like to be involved in. You end up being more and more like each other. What are you doing? You're changing each other into a hybrid, into a blend. And that's okay. In fact, that's right. You see, to be sure, love can change the one you love. But more than that, love changes you. You see, when you choose to love, instead of hate, you benefit the most. You receive the greatest blessings. You gain more than you ever give away. Let's go back to that verse that Scott's already read, and let's add one more verse to it. Verse 18. My little children, let us not love just in word or in tongue. You know, I can say to Lisa, I love you. But if I don't show it, those words don't have a lot of meaning. But how do we love? We love indeed how we act, how we treat each other, indeed and in truth. And by this we know. Now, John loves that word know. It's not just a head knowledge, this is a head and heart knowledge that goes down deep. And by this we know that we are of the truth and shall assure, think of confidence, shall assure our hearts before Him. Literally, here's what John is saying. This is how we convince. This is how we persuade our hearts in His presence. We have that confidence that He loves us and we love Him. Verse number 20. For if our hearts condemn us, you know, the devil can trick us. The devil speaks to us and tries to trick us and tries to trip us up. If our hearts condemn us, if we are overwhelmed by guilt, and we think, well, how can God ever love me again? If our hearts condemn us, God is greater. He's greater than our heart. And He knows all things. He knows the intent of our hearts. When you choose to love, how? Indeed and in truth. That's the words that John used here. When you choose to love indeed and in truth, God assures your heart, even when your heart condemns you. Too often, people listen just to their hearts more than they listen to God Himself. But when you choose to live in His love, you hear God saying, well done, you are my dearly loved child. So here's my first point. So choose to love when people hate you and receive God's assurance to your heart. Hear God say to your heart, I'm proud of you. And find the confidence to keep on serving Him even when you think you've blown it. Even when your own heart condemns you. You know, that's what happened to Peter. Go back to the trial scene. Jesus is on trial before the Sanhedrin. You know, Peter really blew it. He denied knowing Jesus, not once, not twice, but 3 times. And on the 3rd time, even called down curses. And Jesus is on trial when all this is happening. And you remember that on that last denial, Luke records that at that last denial that Jesus himself turned and looked at Peter. If there's ever a time when a look cut through the heart, that was that time. But what do we find out in the very last chapter of the book of John? Later, after Jesus' resurrection, he meets Peter and some of his friends by the Sea of Galilee. They're enjoying some breakfast together when Jesus asks Peter, do you love me? And it's kind of interesting here because Jesus asked, do you love me? The highest form of love. And Peter replies with a lower committal. Yes, I love you, but not as high as the question was that Jesus asked. And Jesus asked the second time, do you love me? And once again, Peter replies back with a lower form of love. So the 3rd time, Jesus lowered his. Do you love me, Peter? What's Jesus doing here? Jesus is bringing Peter back into the fold. Peter had repented. He had went out and wept bitterly, but he still had that guilt. And he had lost his power of influence over the rest of the apostles. So Jesus is asking that same question 3 times, and then Jesus waits until Peter finally appeals to Jesus' knowledge of all things. And Peter says to Jesus, you know everything. You know that I love you. Jesus knew the heart of Peter. He knew how he had repented. He knew how he had wept. And he's restoring him. He's reassuring him back into that leadership. And Peter, along with the other apostles, would deliver that great sermon on the day of Pentecost in Acts chapter 2. When Peter's own heart condemned him, Jesus assured him that he was still a valuable member of the team. Now that's what happens when you choose to love in a world full of hate. God assures your heart that you still belong to Him, and He still wants to use you to do what? To change people's lives around you. You see, the way you treat people reveals what you truly believe about God. Did you know that? If you treat people like royalty, you believe in a gracious and loving Heavenly Father. But if you treat people like dirt, you more likely believe in a ruthless ruler of the universe and not in the gracious God Himself. For just a moment, I want you to think about all the one another verses in the New Testament. You know, there are plenty of times the Bible tells us, love one another, encourage one another, and pray for one another. But did you know the Bible never does say humble one another, scrutinize one another, pressure one another, embarrass one another, corner one another, interrupt one another, defeat one another, sacrifice one another, shame one another, judge one another, run one another's lives, confess one another's sins, intensify one another's sufferings, point out with glee to one another's failings. What does the Bible say? John 3:17. After that very famous John 3:16, Jesus said this, "For God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but that the world through him might be saved." It was the Lord's intent. It was the Lord's purpose to seek and to save the lost. He was focused on those who would believe and obey. He's focused on his children. Now, if you truly believe that, you will treat people with compassion, not condemnation. That because how you treat people reveals what you truly believe about God. So choose, it's a decision, choose to love and receive God's assurance to your own heart that He loves you unconditionally. He loves you. There was a wife that I'm aware of who had a problem. She was addicted to gambling, even to the point that she would even steal from her own family, sell off, pawn what she had to be able to feed her addiction. Her addiction led that family into so many financial problems. And every time that husband would forgive her and take her back, even to the day that she even tried to commit suicide, and they sought medical care for her. He still took her back. The question was asked, and I wanted to know, why would you take her back? So many of your friends are saying, just drop her. I mean, any court of the law would give you the kids. Just leave her because she's bad. She's bad news. That's what the world would say. Here's what that husband said. She's a good mother most of the time, and my children need her. But more than that, they need to know the love of their God. How can they know of a Father in heaven who forgives them if their own earthly father won't forgive their own mother? Well said, husband. That man loved his wife unconditionally. Because why? Because he believed in a God who loved him unconditionally. My dear friends, we got to do the same. Choose to love even those who don't deserve it. And receive God's assurance to your own heart. More than that, choose to love and receive God's answer to your prayers. Notice what it says in John 3, verse 21. Beloved, if our heart does not condemn us, we have confidence toward God. Get what you need from God because you give what He asks of you. Attain a hearing from God because you hear and listen to Him. How can we expect God to forgive us and love us if we can't forgive and love the people around us? If we can't love that person sitting next to us, or sitting in the pew in front of us, or the pew behind us? Literally, what we have outspokenness or frankness before God. When we love, we can be bold in prayer. Verse 22, and whatever we ask, we receive from Him. Because we keep His commandments. Why are we receiving? Because we are living in Him. We keep His commandments and do those things that are pleasing in His sight. We're living for God. Fran Tarkenton was a all-pro quarterback. Most of his career played for the Minnesota Vikings. Went to the Super Bowl 3 times. He wrote an interesting article that I found in the Wall Street Journal. He wrote about prayer. And he would say, every time in the locker room before we'd go out on the field, we would gather together. And the coach would call on whoever was deemed the most religious person in the group to lead a prayer. And they would lead a very heart-spoken prayer. And then when the prayer was over, the guy who led the prayer and the whole team would yell out, "Now let's go out there and kill those guys." That's not the intent of prayer. That's not the spirit of prayer at all. Psalm chapter 66, "If I regard iniquity, sin, in my heart, the Lord will not hear." 1 John 5, verse 14. "Now this is the confidence that we have in Him, that if we ask anything according to His will, He hears us." God's will is that we love people, the people He places in our paths each day. So when we pray with an attitude of love, God hears and answers our prayers with the best answer. The best answer could be yes or no or maybe later, but He'll always give us the best answer. A few years ago, a speaker was asked to speak at an event. And before the guy got up to speak, he was a guest speaker. Before he got up to speak, they made an announcement about a tremendous need of a missionary. There was a tremendous need to raise $5,000. And as the person who was introducing the speaker, as that person was introducing the speaker, they said, "Now would you lead us in a prayer that God will provide for that missionary in that foreign land?" The speaker surprised them. He said, "No, I will not lead that prayer. But here's what I'll do." He got out his wallet, out of his back pocket. He opened it up, showing what money he had. He took every dollar out of his wallet, put it on the pulpit. He said, "I'll do this. I will ask everybody in this auditorium to march up here, open up your billfold, and put every dollar you have." Now, I'm not asking for checks. I'm not asking for credit cards. I want you to put every dollar you have here on the pulpit. After that, I will lead a prayer thanking God for providing. And if God doesn't provide $5,000, then I'll pray that He will somehow provide the rest. One by one, everybody came up, opened up their wallets, opened up their purses, and put their money on the pulpit. After they were through, they counted the money. It was $7,000. And that man prayed, thanking God for providing even more than what the missionary asked for. The speaker said this: "The sheer audacity of asking God for $5,000 when God had already provided more than $7,000 in our wallets and purses." Prayer is not enough unless we're willing to love people in word and in deed. Was it good to pray for that missionary? Yes. But he needed the $5,000 in word and in deed. When you do, God answers abundantly beyond all that we could ask or even think. So choose to love. Choose to love and receive God's assurance to your own heart. Choose to love and receive God's answer to your prayers. And finally, choose to love and receive God's abiding presence in your life. Is God living in you? Find yourself at home with God. Find yourself at home with God and discover what it means to dwell with God and He with you. Verse number 23, "And this is His commandment, that we should believe on the name of His Son, Jesus Christ, and love one another as He gave us." Commandment. You know, Jesus talked about this. The Christian life is really very simple. As followers of Christ, All He asks us to do is believe in Him and love people. Depend on His power and love the people, the person right in front of you. There's a missionary that I'm acquainted with in Puerto Rico who summed it up best. I only need 2 loves in my life, to love God and love the person next to me. And he's been very effective in Puerto Rico. The Bible is all about loving God and loving people around us. When Jesus was asked about the greatest commandment, He said, first, love God with all your heart, your soul, and your mind, and 2, to love your neighbor as yourself. And then He wrapped that up with verse 40 of Matthew 22. On these 2 commandments hang all the law and the prophets. If you went through the entire Old Testament, you could summarize the whole Old Testament in those 2 laws right there. 1 John chapter 3, once again, verse 23. Believe and love. The 2 go hand in hand, because you cannot truly love people if you don't believe in Jesus. If you don't depend on Him, you can't truly love the way He wants you to love. However, as you trust Christ with your life and you live in daily dependence on Him, He gives you the love. He gives you the love that you need to love people, especially those who are difficult to love. Guess what? There are people in your world who are difficult to love. That's not a news flash. That's a reality. But you're to love them. You are to love them. Then when you do that, you find yourself at home with God. You feel that God is living in you because He is. You abide in Him and He abides in you. Verse 24. Now he who keeps His commandment abides in Him, lives in Him, and He in Him. And by this we know that He abides in us. How? By the Spirit whom He has given us. When you choose to love instead of hate, when you choose to trust Jesus and love people, then we find ourselves at home with God and He with us. And it just becomes second nature, and you love it. That's because God is love. That's what it says in chapter 4, verse 8. God is love, and so we choose to dwell in love, and we are choosing to dwell in Him. Ladies, does your husband's hobbies ever drive you up the wall? Okay, in some cases they do. One wife was just all put out by her husband's fixation on hawks and especially eagles. They lived in an area here in the United States that had a lot of hawks and a lot of falcons and a lot of eagles. And when he would be driving down the road and he would see one, he'd have to stop and go chase it, go follow it down the trail, down the path in the woods. And so many times they would be late arriving at an appointment or arriving at a destination. Because why? Because her husband had spent some time chasing the birds. And she just hated it. She hated hawks. She hated eagles. Until one summer, because of his work, he had to leave the country and he was gone for the whole summer. And then she suddenly started noticing hawks and eagles herself and started noticing how pretty they were, flying around, soaring, gliding through the air. And she had never noticed them before until that summer. She said this, seeing those birds, really seeing them for the first time in my life, I understood that I was not seeing them with my own eyes, but I was seeing them with my husband's eyes. He was not there, so I was seeing them for him. He was absent, or was he absent? Because he was present in my heart, in me. You see, God is devoted to people. He's devoted to you. He's devoted to me, even to that person who might hurt you, because He wants that person to come and become a child of His. When you can learn to see them with His eyes, like that wife saw the eagles with her husband's eyes. When you can see people with His eyes, with God's eyes, you love them as He loved them. You discover that He is present in you. So ask Jesus to help you. Because He loved even those who nailed Him to a cross. He said, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Choose to love and receive God's assurance to your heart. See, that's a benefit. That's a benefit of God's love. Choose to love and receive God's answer to your prayer. That's a benefit of God's love. And choose to love and receive God's abiding presence in your life. That's a benefit of God's love. Students in a high school history class were discussing the days of Charlemagne. The teacher said, I want you to know that in the days of chivalry, they had a very high regard. The men had a very high regard for the women. And they placed the women up on a pedestal and they wrote poems about them. They wrote songs about the women. And the teacher said, do you know what you call those men? One girl in the class said, yes, I do, teacher. You call them wise men. I want you to be wise today. I want you to believe, to repent, to confess, and be baptized. That puts you into Christ. You become a Christian. If, as a Christian, you need to seek His forgiveness, He will forgive, 1 John 1:9. The church stands ready to pray with you and for you, James 5:16. If you have any need at all to respond, please do so while we stand and sing for your encouragement.